My husband told me, "Don't embarrass me. You're too plain for my wealthy colleagues. Stay in your lane." I agreed quietly. I smiled and said, "Sure." A week later he nearly choked when I walked into his private club as the owner. His so-called friends bowed to the woman he once dismissed. "Don't embarrass me tonight. You're too plain for my wealthy colleagues. Stay in your lane." Clark delivered these words while adjusting his Hermes tie in our bedroom mirror, speaking as casually as if he were commenting on the weather. I stood behind him, holding the cocktail dress I'd been about to put on for the Meridian Club dinner, watching his reflection for any sign that he recognized the cruelty of what he'd just said. There was none. He simply continued knotting his tie, oblivious to the fact that his plain wife had personally approved every one of his colleagues' memberships to the very club where tonight's dinner would occur, that the building they worshipped as a temple of success bore my name on the deed. Before we continue, I want to thank you for being here. If you believe that no one should be dismissed as too plain for success, please consider subscribing. It helps more women hear these powerful stories. I hung the dress back in the closet, my movements deliberate and calm. "Of course," I said. "I understand." He smiled then, that satisfied expression he wore when a negotiation went his way. "Good. These Korean clients expect a certain standard. Morrison's wife spent 2 hours at the salon today just for this dinner. Blackstone's wife flew to New York last week for a new outfit." He turned from the mirror to face me directly. "You have to understand, Audrey, that at this level appearance matters. First impressions are everything." 4 years of marriage and he still believed I didn't grasp basic social concepts. I wanted to tell him that I'd watched those same wives stumble through small talk at a dozen events, their salon hair and designer clothes unable to mask their desperate need for approval. Instead, I straightened his already perfect tie, playing the role he'd cast me in since our wedding day. "What time will you be home?" I asked. "Late. These dinners run long, especially when we're closing deals." He checked his Rolex, the one he'd bought to impress Morrison, not knowing that Morrison's own watch was a fake that I'd chosen to ignore when reviewing his membership application. "There's leftover pasta in the fridge if you get hungry." The leftover pasta from 3 nights ago, when he'd ordered Italian from the place that charged $40 for basic marinara because they delivered to Meridian Club members. He'd eaten barely half his portion, complaining the sauce was too acidic, while I finished my sandwich from the deli down the street. After he left, trailing cologne that cost more than our monthly utilities, I sat at our small dining table and opened my laptop. Not to check our bank balance or browse social media, but to review the quarterly reports for V. Monroe Holdings. The portfolio my grandmother had built from nothing, the empire she'd constructed while men like Clark dismissed her as furniture in their boardrooms. My phone buzzed with a message from Marcus Blackwood, the general manager at Meridian. "Mrs. Hartwell, tonight's dinner is proceeding as planned. Your husband's table is set for 12. Shall I maintain standard protocol?" Standard protocol meant treating me like a ghost when Clark was present, pretending the owner of the establishment didn't exist. I'd maintained this charade for 3 years, watching Clark preen in my building while telling people his wife worked in administration, with a dismissive wave that suggested I filed papers for a living. "Yes," I typed back. "For now." The apartment felt smaller after Clark left, or maybe it just felt more honest. Without his presence demanding space, requiring accommodation, needing constant validation that he was climbing the right ladder fast enough, I could breathe. I walked to our bedroom closet and pushed aside the row of Clark's suits, Armani, Hugo Boss, Tom Ford, to reach the back wall where I kept a single garment bag he'd never noticed. Inside hung a Saint Laurent dress my grandmother had bought in 1982, the year she made her first million. She'd worn it exactly once, to a shareholder meeting where she'd gained controlling interest in her first commercial property. "Save it," she told me during those final weeks in the hospital. "Wear it the day you stop hiding." I ran my fingers across the fabric, still perfect after all these years. Clark would call it plain, black, simple lines, no embellishments. He wouldn't understand that its power lay in its simplicity, that the woman wearing it didn't need decoration to command a room. My phone rang. Janet, my cousin, whose name appeared above a photo from Better Times, before her husband had turned their marriage into a transaction and she turned her pain into Xanax and wine. "I need to see you," she said without preamble. "Robert's at it again. I found receipts." "Come over," I said. "Clark's at a dinner." At Meridian? Where else? She laughed, but it was bitter. Must be nice being married to someone important enough for Meridian. I bit back the irony of her statement. Janet arrived 20 minutes later, her designer handbag worth more than our rent but her face showing the exhaustion that money couldn't fix. She collapsed onto our second-hand couch, the one Clark complained about whenever we had company, and started crying before she'd even taken off her coat. 23 years old, she said between sobs. His personal trainer. Can you believe it? I'm 42, Audrey. When did I become the disposable wife? I sat beside her, offering tissues and silence. There were no good words for this moment, no comfort that wouldn't sound hollow. Janet had married Robert for love, or what she'd thought was love, and discovered too late that he'd married her for her trust fund and connections. Clark doesn't even hide it anymore, Janet continued. Robert, I mean. He takes her to Meridian for lunch. Books the private dining room. The staff all know they give me these pitying looks when I'm there. The staff at my club, witnessing the destruction of my cousin's marriage in my private dining room. I made a mental note to review Robert's membership status. There were standards to maintain, even if Clark didn't think I understood such concepts. What are you going to do? I asked. Leave him. Take what I can get in the divorce and start over. She looked around our apartment, taking in the shabby furniture, the cramped space, the absence of luxury. You're lucky, you know. Clark might not be rich, but at least he comes home to you. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of her statement. Clark came home to the idea of me, the convenient wife who kept his life organized while staying out of his real world. But Janet didn't need my problems tonight. She needed my couch, my silence, and my promise not to judge her for what came next. After she left, I stood at our bedroom window watching the city lights sparkle below. Somewhere out there, Clark was sitting in my club at my table, surrounded by people who owed their membership to my approval, telling them his wife was too plain for their company. The thought should have hurt, but instead, it crystallized something that had been forming since I'd found my grandmother's will. Being underestimated was a weapon, but only if you knew when to reveal your true power. Tonight wasn't that night. But soon, very soon, Clark would learn that the plain wife he'd dismissed owned the very kingdom he was so desperate to conquer. Monday morning arrived with Clark already gone to the office, leaving only the lingering scent of his cologne and a note reminding me to pick up his suits from the dry cleaner. Mrs. Kim's shop sat 3 blocks from our apartment, wedged between a Vietnamese restaurant and a failing bookstore, the kind of neighborhood Clark called transitional when explaining why we lived there. Mrs. Kim looked up from her pressing machine as I entered, her face brightening with the particular smile she reserved for regular customers who actually talked to her. Mrs. Hartwell. I have Mr. Hartwell's suits ready. Such beautiful fabric. He must be very successful. He likes to look professional, I said, pulling out my wallet. She disappeared into the back, returning with 5 suits wrapped in plastic. As she rang them up, she tilted her head thoughtfully. I saw him last Tuesday at that fancy Meridian club. My nephew works valet there. Very exclusive place. Tuesday. Clark had called that morning about a client emergency, said he'd be in depositions all day. Kept my voice steady. Oh. He has lots of meetings there. Yes, with that elegant blonde woman. Such a lovely laugh. My nephew says you can hear it across the whole dining room. Very charming. Is she his sister? They seem very close. My fingers tightened on my credit card, but I managed a neutral expression. Must be someone from the firm. They often have team lunches. Mrs. Kim nodded, but something in her eyes suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Every Tuesday, my nephew says. Same table by the window. Same woman. She must be very important client. I signed the receipt, my signature slightly shakier than usual. Clark works with many important people. Outside, I stood on the sidewalk holding $5,000 worth of suits while processing what Mrs. Kim had inadvertently revealed. Every Tuesday. The same woman. An elegant blonde with a memorable laugh. Clark had worked late every Tuesday for the past 2 months, always with excuses about difficult clients or urgent briefs. Back at the apartment, I hung his suits in our bedroom closet, each one in its designated spot because Clark insisted on organization. My phone buzzed with a text from Janet. Can I come by? Robert's at another conference, and I can't stand being alone. She arrived 30 minutes later with coffee and pastries from the expensive bakery Clark always said we couldn't afford. We sat at my small dining table and I watched her pick apart a croissant without eating any of it. "I need to use your bathroom," she said suddenly, getting up before I could respond. But instead of heading to the bathroom, I heard her footsteps in the hallway. "Audrey," she called, "where do you keep extra blankets? I'm freezing." "Hall closet, top shelf," I replied, not thinking about what else was stored there. The sound that followed wasn't quite a scream, more like a sharp intake of breath that seemed to go on forever. I found Janet sitting on the hallway floor, surrounded by papers she'd accidentally knocked down while reaching for blankets. Financial statements spread around her like fallen leaves. Property deeds. Investment portfolios. And there, right in front of her, the Meridian Club ownership documents with my name printed clearly across the top. "Audrey." Her voice came out strangled. "What is this?" I knelt beside her, gathering papers with steady hands. "Something Clark doesn't know about." "Doesn't know about? You own Meridian?" "The Meridian Club where Robert and Clark practically live. My grandmother left it to me. Among other things." Janet's eyes scanned the documents, her expression shifting from shock to something harder. $80 million. You have $80 million and Clark doesn't know. He never asked. He assumed I was what I appeared to be. But why? Why hide this? I sat back against the wall, holding the papers against my chest. Grandma spent 40 years being invisible in boardrooms while men stole her ideas. She wanted to know if Clark loved me or the idea of what I could give him. And Tuesday lunches with an elegant blonde woman. Every week. Same table by the window. Janet's face darkened. "That piece of..." She stopped herself, then looked at me with new understanding. "You're planning something." "I'm waiting," I corrected. "There's a difference." She helped me return everything to its hiding place, then sat back at the dining table with a different energy. "You know what? We're both idiots. Hiding who we are, accepting whatever crumbs they throw us." Before I could respond, my phone rang. Clark's name appeared on the screen. "Great news," he said without greeting. "Morrison just called. I made senior partner. Youngest in the firm's history." "Congratulations," I began, but he was already continuing. "There's a celebration dinner tomorrow night at Meridian. Black tie, very exclusive. Morrison says it's partners only though. Wives will have their own event next month. Some kind of tea or something more appropriate to your interests." More appropriate to my interests. As if he had any idea what my interests were. "I understand," I said. "You're not upset? I know you were looking forward to the partners' dinner." I had never once expressed interest in his firm's dinners. He was projecting what he thought I should want, then dismissing it preemptively. "No, Clark. Enjoy your celebration. You're the best, Audrey. So understanding. Morrison's wife throws fits about these things, but you get it. You know your place." After he hung up, Janet stared at me. "You know your place?" He actually said that. He says a lot of things. That night, Clark practiced his acceptance speech in our bathroom mirror while I lay on our bed, listening through the thin door. He thanked Morrison for the mentorship, Blackstone for the partnership, the mysterious Tuesday woman he referred to as Charlotte from consulting for her invaluable support. Not one mention of the wife who'd worked 2 jobs to put him through law school, who'd typed his briefs when he broke his wrist, who'd attended every meaningless firm picnic and pretended his colleagues' stories were interesting. While he delivered his speech to his reflection, I retrieved my car keys and drove to the storage unit across town. Clark thought I couldn't afford a car, didn't know about the BMW registered to V. Monroe Holdings that I kept for moments when I needed to be myself. The storage unit held everything Clark had never bothered to ask about. My grandmother's furniture, too valuable for our apartment but too meaningful to sell. Boxes of photographs from her years of building an empire in silence. And there, in a trunk that hadn't been opened since her funeral, her leather journal. I sat on the concrete floor and read by the fluorescent lights. Her handwriting, strong at first then gradually weakening, documented every slight, every stolen idea, every moment when men had taken credit for her brilliance. But alongside the indignities were the triumphs, carefully recorded in financial terms. The first profitable quarter. The first million. The first property. The acquisition of Meridian, bought from a man who'd laughed at her investment proposals 20 years earlier. The final entry written a week before she died, made me close the journal and hold it against my chest. Audrey will understand the value of being underestimated. Let them think you're nobody until the moment you show them you're everything. I drove back from the storage unit with my grandmother's journal on the passenger seat, her words echoing in my mind as I navigated the empty streets at midnight. Clark was asleep when I returned, sprawled across our bed in his Harvard Law t-shirt, taking up 3/4 of the mattress as if even in sleep he needed to claim more than his share. The next morning arrived like any other, except this time I knew it would be different. I stood in the kitchen organizing the pantry, placing Clark's overpriced organic pasta in perfect rows because he insisted that visual organization promoted mental clarity. Behind me, I heard him enter the kitchen, his footsteps carrying that particular weight of someone about to deliver what they considered wisdom. He stopped at the microwave, using its black surface as a mirror to adjust his Hermes tie. The silence stretched between us as I continued arranging his gluten-free crackers, waiting for whatever complaint he'd prepared for today. "Don't embarrass me tonight," he said suddenly, his tone conversational as if discussing the weather. "You're too plain for my wealthy colleagues. Stay in your lane." The can of San Marzano tomatoes in my hand weighed exactly 14 ounces according to its label. I focused on that weight, on the way the metal felt against my palm, on anything except the urge to turn around and demonstrate exactly how much damage 14 ounces of canned tomatoes could inflict on a perfectly styled head of hair. From the living room, I heard Janet's coffee cup hit the saucer with a sharp clink. She'd heard everything through our paper-thin walls, the ones Clark constantly complained about but refused to leave because the address was respectable enough for his business cards. "Of course," I said, my voice steady as I placed the can on its designated shelf. "I understand." Clark made a satisfied sound, the kind he produced when a negotiation went his way. He grabbed his travel mug of precisely heated coffee and headed for the door, not bothering with a goodbye kiss or even a backward glance. The apartment door closed with its usual protest from the loose hinges he kept promising to fix. Janet appeared in the kitchen doorway before Clark's footsteps had faded from the hallway. Her face carried the kind of rage that made her look younger, more like the cousin who'd defended me from schoolyard bullies than the woman whose husband was destroying her with his affairs. "I'm going after him," she announced, already moving toward the door. That pathetic excuse for a man needs to hear exactly what. I raised my hand and she stopped mid-step. No. Audrey, he just told you that you're too plain for his precious colleagues. I know what he said. I turned from the pantry to face her fully. "This is my battle, Janet. And it needs to be planned, not reactive." She stood there vibrating with fury on my behalf, and something in my expression must have communicated what I couldn't say aloud yet. Slowly, she walked to our second-hand couch, the one Clark deemed embarrassing whenever anyone visited, and collapsed into its worn cushions. "For years," she said, her voice quieter now but no less intense. "4 years of this and you just take it?" I sat beside her, feeling the familiar sag of cushions that had supported too many difficult conversations. "Tell me what you see, Janet." "All of it." She laughed, but it held no humor. "Where do I start? The birthday he forgot because Morrison needed a fourth for golf? The anniversary dinner he canceled 20 minutes before the reservation because Blackstone wanted to discuss strategy over drinks?" Her hands moved as she spoke, painting Clark's failures in the air between us. "The way he introduces you at events, when he actually brings you, 'This is Audrey, she does administrative work,' with that little wave like he's brushing away a fly." Each word landed with precision, confirming what I'd recorded in my mental ledger for years. "He doesn't even see you," Janet continued. "You're just functionality to him. Someone who keeps his life organized while he pursues what he thinks matters." "And what would hurt him most?" I asked. Janet's eyes sharpened. "Public humiliation. Complete, undeniable, witnessed by everyone humiliation. Clark's entire identity is built on what others think of him. Take that away." She trailed off, understanding dawning on her face. "You're going to destroy him at Meridian." I pulled out my phone and found the contact I'd saved under MB Emergency. Marcus Blackwood's private number, given to me by my grandmother with explicit instructions to use it when the time came. My finger hovered over the call button for a moment, then pressed down. The phone rang twice before a cultured British accent answered. "Mrs. Hartwell. I wondered when you might call." "Hello, Marcus." It's about time, if I may say so. 20 years I worked for your grandmother, and 3 years I've watched you tolerate that insufferable man in your establishment. You knew. My dear woman, I've known since your first visit. Your grandmother showed me your photograph every week during her final year. This is Audrey, she'd say. She'll understand when she's ready. My throat tightened at the image of my grandmother, dying but still planning my future. I'm ready now. Excellent. The partners' dinner is Thursday, I believe? Your husband has requested the Churchill room. He has good taste in rooms he can't afford. Marcus chuckled. Indeed. Shall we discuss arrangements? I assume you'll want Philippe present. The photographer? The very same. He's captured every significant Meridian moment for the past decade. Very discreet, but his images have a way of circulating among the membership. We spent 20 minutes crafting the details. The seating arrangement that would place Clark at what he thought was the head of the table but would actually become a stage for his humiliation. The timing that would ensure maximum visibility. The specific moment when Marcus would make his announcement, after appetizers but before the main course, when alcohol had loosened inhibitions but hadn't yet clouded judgment. After ending the call, I looked at Janet, who'd been listening with undisguised glee. I need clothes. You need armor, she corrected, grabbing her keys. And I know exactly where to get it. The drive to Nordstrom felt like crossing between two worlds. Janet pulled into the valet area, ignoring my protest about the expense, and led me through doors I'd only walked past before. The private shopping suite occupied the top floor, accessible only by special elevator, a space Clark didn't know existed because he'd never thought to look beyond the regular departments. I pulled out the black American Express card linked to V. Monroe Holdings, the one Clark had never seen because he'd never asked about my wallet's contents. The saleswoman's eyes widened slightly at the card's weight and design. Metal, not plastic, with no preset spending limit. How may I assist you today? She asked, her entire demeanor shifting to accommodate serious money. I need something that says power, Janet announced before I could speak. Something that makes every man in a room stand up when she walks in. What followed was a transformation that cost more than Clark claimed we had in our savings. A black Saint Laurent dress that seemed simple until you noticed the perfect cut, the way it suggested rather than revealed. Louboutin heels that added 3 inches and changed my entire posture. Diamond earrings that had belonged to my grandmother, retrieved from the safety deposit box Clark didn't know existed. Standing before the 3-way mirror, I saw someone else entirely. Not plain Audrey who organized pantries and accepted insults. This was someone who owned buildings, who controlled destinies, who could destroy a man with a single word. This was who my grandmother had always known I could become. Janet dropped me at our apartment building after our shopping expedition, the Nordstrom bags hidden in her trunk until I could retrieve them later without Clark noticing. The doorman, Mr. Peterson, gave me his usual nod, unaware that I'd already drafted the paperwork to double his salary once I took ownership of the building next month. Tuesday arrived with Clark leaving early for what he called strategic planning sessions, but I now knew were extended breakfasts with Charlotte Blackstone. I waited until his Uber turned the corner before walking 6 blocks to the office building Clark had never noticed, the one with V. Monroe Holdings listed discreetly on the directory between a dental practice and an accounting firm. My real office occupied half of the 14th floor, a space my grandmother had designed with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city she'd conquered in silence. Clark believed I spent my Tuesdays at the community college taking spreadsheet courses, a fiction he'd created and I'd never corrected. The irony of him explaining Excel functions to me while I managed multimillion-dollar property portfolios never stopped being darkly amusing. I settled at my desk and pulled up Meridian's membership database on my computer, the master files that contained far more than just names and addresses. Every incident report, every complaint, every whispered scandal that Marcus had documented over 20 years appeared in these digital files, my grandmother's insistence on thorough record-keeping now serving as ammunition. Morrison's file came first. Inherited membership from his father in 1998, the transfer process despite 3 separate violations for what the reports delicately termed inappropriate conduct with female staff. 2 settlements paid quietly, 1 server who'd transferred to our Phoenix property after Morrison cornered her in the wine cellar. Clark idolized this man, called him a titan of industry. I made notes about Thursday's seating arrangement, ensuring Morrison would have the perfect view of his protégé's downfall. Blackstone's record proved even more interesting. His wife Charlotte, the elegant blonde who lunched with my husband every Tuesday, had spent 2 years campaigning for membership. The file contained 17 letters, each more desperate than the last, offering increasingly large donations and promising referrals of other wealthy applicants. She'd finally received approval only after her father-in-law, a federal judge, threatened to investigate our liquor license. The weakness in her desperation would serve me well on Thursday. Reeves had attempted to buy his way in with a $50,000 donation before anyone explained that Meridian didn't accept bribes, only qualifications. His file included a note from Marcus, money but no class. Approved only due to father-in-law's pharmaceutical holdings. Watch for inappropriate behavior. Thursday would be his last dinner at my club. My phone buzzed with a text from Janet. "You need to see this. Coming to your office." She arrived 20 minutes later, her face flushed with the excitement of discovery. Without speaking, she handed me her phone, Charlotte Blackstone's Instagram account already open on the screen. The evidence spread before me like a roadmap of betrayal. 12 photos over 6 months, all geotagged at Meridian, all featuring Clark despite Charlotte's careful attempts to keep him partially out of frame. But I recognized my husband's watch, his hands, the way he held his wine glass with 3 fingers instead of 2. "Power lunch with brilliant minds," read the caption from 3 weeks ago. Clark's sleeve visible at the edge of the frame. "Discussing futures with someone special," from last month. His reflection caught in her sunglasses. "Some conversations change everything," posted yesterday. His monogrammed cufflinks that I'd given him for our anniversary clearly visible as he reached across the table. Janet screenshot each photo methodically while I sat back in my grandmother's leather chair, understanding finally washing over me. This wasn't about my appearance. Clark hadn't rejected me for being plain. He'd already chosen my replacement, someone whose husband traveled internationally 3 weeks of every month. Someone whose desperation for status matched his own. "She's been hunting him," Janet said quietly. "Look at the progression. The photos get bolder. The captions more intimate. She's marking territory. Let her mark all she wants. After Thursday, neither of them will be welcome in any establishment I own." Wednesday passed in careful preparation. I confirmed details with Marcus, arranged for Philippe to have unrestricted access for photography, and reviewed the presentation Clark had left on our dining table. His proposal for the Korean executives was good but not great, lacking the property holdings and international connections that would seal the deal. Information I possessed but he'd never thought to ask about. Thursday morning dawned gray and humid, the kind of weather that made Clark irritable about his hair. I woke at my usual time, prepared his breakfast with mechanical precision, and listened to him complain about the humidity's effect on his appearance while eating the eggs I'd made exactly how he liked them. He spent 2 hours preparing for the dinner, trying on 3 different ties before settling on the Hermes I'd seen him wear to every important meeting for the past year. I sat on our bed with a paperback romance novel, the kind with a shirtless man on the cover that Clark found embarrassing, and watched him practice his presentation in the mirror. "The key," he said to his reflection, "is making them feel exclusive. Like they're joining something rarefied." I turned a page loudly. He glanced at my book with undisguised disdain. "You should try reading something substantial," he said. "The Financial Times, perhaps. Though I suppose it might be difficult for you to follow." "You're probably right," I agreed, returning to my book about a secretary who inherits a fortune and destroys everyone who'd dismissed her. Clark didn't appreciate irony. He left at 7:30. Spending 5 minutes adjusting his appearance in the hallway mirror while explaining that these dinners ran late and I shouldn't wait up. The conversation would be about international markets and complex negotiations, things that would bore me. He suggested I order Thai food from the place I liked, maybe watch one of those reality shows that required no intellectual investment. The door closed behind him without a goodbye kiss, a tradition he'd abandoned so long ago I'd forgotten what his lips felt like. 20 minutes later, I stood in our bathroom beginning the ritual my grandmother had taught me during those final months when she could barely stand but still insisted on attending board meetings. This wasn't about beauty. Clark was right that I was plain. This was about presence, about transforming into someone who commanded attention through power rather than prettiness. The The Saint Laurent dress slipped on like liquid shadow, transforming my body into something architectural. The Louboutins changed my posture, forcing my spine straight and my shoulders back. The diamond earrings caught the light like captured stars, the same earrings my grandmother had worn to every meeting where men tried to buy her out, push her out or force her out. Janet arrived to help with my hair, sweeping it into the same chignon my grandmother had worn for 40 years of battles in boardrooms. She handed me the leather portfolio containing the ownership documents, the proof of what Clark had never bothered to discover. The car waited outside, James behind the wheel of the Bentley that Clark didn't know existed. When he saw me walking toward the car, his eyes filled with tears. "Mrs. Audrey," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You look just like her when she was about to destroy someone." James pulled the Bentley onto Meridian's private drive with the smooth precision of someone who had performed this maneuver countless times, though never with me in the back seat. Through the tinted windows, I watched the building's facade come into view, limestone and glass rising into the night sky, lit from below with subtle gold lighting that made the entire structure appear to glow from within. This was my building, though I'd only ever entered through the service entrance on the few occasions when I'd needed to sign documents Marcus couldn't bring to my office. 8:45 exactly, Mrs. Hartwell, James announced, his eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. "Shall I pull to the main entrance?" "Yes." "Let them see the car." The Bentley glided to a stop beneath the portico where Thomas, the head valet who'd been working these doors for 15 years, stood ready. The moment he saw the license plate, VMH001, my grandmother's personal designation, his entire posture changed. His usual efficient movements became almost reverential as he reached for my door handle. "Miss Monroe," he breathed, then caught himself. "Mrs. Hartwell. Welcome to Meridian." The name correction hung in the air between us, heavy with significance. Every staff member knew the Monroe name, knew the stories of my grandmother's monthly inspections, her exacting standards, her ability to recognize every employee by name despite running an empire. They'd been waiting 3 years to see if I would ever claim my inheritance publicly. I stepped out of the Bentley, the click of my heels on the portico's marble announcing my arrival like a drum roll. Through the glass doors, I could see the lobby staff trying to maintain their professional composure while simultaneously attempting to get a better view of the woman they'd only known through signatures on paychecks and glimpses of legal documents. Robert Chin, the head concierge who'd started as a bellhop under my grandmother's management, approached with measured steps that couldn't quite hide his urgency. His usual pristine composure showed cracks, a slight tremor in his hands, eyes bright with something between excitement and vindication. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, his voice carrying 40 years of hospitality experience. "Everything has been arranged according to your specifications. The Churchill room is prepared, the staff has been briefed, and Mr. Blackwood is awaiting your arrival in the observatory lounge." "And my husband?" Robert's expression shifted minutely, professional discretion warring with personal opinion. "Mr. Hartwell arrived 30 minutes ago with the partners from his firm. He's currently entertaining the Korean delegation." The pause before entertaining told me everything. I could picture Clark holding court, 3 drinks deep into his performance, playing the role of power broker in my establishment while the actual power stood in the lobby in designer heels. "Charlotte Blackstone?" I asked. Seated to Mr. Hartwell's immediate right. Her proximity has been noted by several of the other partners' wives. Of course it had. Charlotte's desperate social climbing was as subtle as a neon sign, and the wives of Meridian had spent decades perfecting the art of cataloging inappropriate behavior for future ammunition. I walked through the lobby, my heels creating a rhythm against the marble that seemed to draw every eye in the space. The night manager, Sarah, actually curtsied, an involuntary dip that she immediately tried to convert into reaching for something on her desk. 2 servers carrying champagne trays stopped mid-stride to watch me pass. The entire atmosphere shifted, as if the building itself recognized its true owner had finally arrived. The observatory lounge occupied a mezzanine level that overlooked the main dining rooms through specially treated glass. You could see out, but no one could see in. Marcus Blackwood stood near the windows, his silver hair catching the soft lighting as he observed the Churchill room below. "Punctual as always," he said without turning. "Your grandmother would be pleased." I joined him at the window, looking down at the scene unfolding in my private dining room. The Churchill room was Meridian's crown jewel, circular with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city, a baccarat chandelier that cost more than most people's annual salaries, and a table that could seat 20 but tonight held only 12. Clark sat at what he believed was the head of the table, his back to the door in a position that would have made my grandmother laugh. Never sit with your back to the entrance, she taught me. That's how you miss seeing your enemies arrive. He was gesturing expansively with his champagne flute, his face flushed with alcohol and self-importance. The Korean executives, Mr. Kim, Mr. Park, and Ms. Lee, according to my files, maintained expressions of polite interest that didn't quite mask their boredom. They'd heard this pitch before, or versions of it, from dozens of American firms trying to break into Asian markets without understanding the culture. Morrison sat to Clark's left, his face already red from wine, occasionally interjecting comments that Clark would then expand upon as if they were his own ideas. Blackstone hunched over his phone, typing with the focused intensity of someone managing a crisis, probably related to his wife's increasingly obvious attraction to my husband. Charlotte Blackstone had positioned herself as close to Clark as social propriety allowed, her chair angled toward him, her body language screaming availability to anyone with eyes. Every few seconds she touched his arm, his shoulder, the back of his chair, each contact lasting a beat too long to be casual. Her wedding ring, an ostentatious display of diamonds that her husband had bought to compensate for his absences, caught the light with every gesture. Reeves sat at the far end, excluded from the main conversation but laughing too loudly at every joke, desperate to be included in a circle that would never fully accept him. His wife, a nervous woman who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, clutched her purse in her lap and said nothing. "Your husband is on his 4th glass of champagne," Marcus observed clinically. "His presentation skills tend to deteriorate after 3. Let him drink." Loose tongues reveal true thoughts. Marcus pulled out his iPad, swiping through screens with practiced efficiency. The photographer is positioned in the southeast corner. He has clear angles of the entire table. The staff has been instructed to serve the appetizer course at 9, main course at 9:45. Your entrance has been scheduled for 9:15, after appetizers but before the conversation turns fully to business. He showed me another screen. Membership records for everyone at the table, their violations, their payments, their secrets all catalogued in my grandmother's meticulous system. "Reeves has 2 violations this month alone," Marcus noted, both involving inappropriate comments to female staff. "His membership is already under review. After tonight it won't matter." Below us, Clark stood, raising his champagne glass for what appeared to be a toast. Even through the soundproof glass I could see his mouth forming words, his free hand gesturing to encompass the room, the moment, his imagined triumph. "He's toasting to the future," Marcus translated, reading lips with the skill of someone who'd spent decades in hospitality. "To partnerships that transcend borders. To success that lesser men can only dream of." Lesser men. The phrase burned in my chest, fuel for what was about to come. "Ms. Lee speaks fluent English," Marcus continued, though she's been politely pretending otherwise to avoid Clark's attempts at conversation. "Mr. Kim and Mr. Park have already decided to pass on the proposal. Their translator informed me they're only staying out of courtesy." Clark sat down to applause from his colleagues, basking in their approval while Charlotte whispered something in his ear that made him smile. The kind of smile I hadn't seen directed at me in 2 years. Marcus closed his iPad and turned to face me fully. "Your grandmother once told me that revenge is best served not cold, but at exactly the right temperature. Too soon and it lacks impact. Too late and it loses meaning. And tonight is perfectly calibrated." At exactly 9:10 Clark stood again, champagne glass raised for another toast. Through the glass I watched him perform for his audience, unaware that his Real audience stood 1 floor above, watching him the way a cat watches a mouse that doesn't yet know it's trapped. Marcus checked his watch. 5 minutes, Mrs. Hartwell." I nodded once and he turned toward the dining room doors to begin the final act of Clark's public life as he knew it. Marcus moved away from my side with the measured steps of someone approaching a lit fuse, knowing the explosion was inevitable but maintaining professional composure nonetheless. I watched from my position just outside the dining room doors as he navigated between the seated guests with practiced precision, approaching Morrison's chair with the gravity of a court bailiff delivering a verdict. The whisper he delivered into Morrison's ear was brief, perhaps 5 seconds, but Morrison's reaction was immediate and dramatic. His face drained of color so quickly I thought he might faint. Then he shot to his feet with such force that his chair tipped backward, crashing against the credenza with a sound that made everyone jump. His wine glass, forgotten in his hand, tilted dangerously before he set it down with shaking fingers. Blackstone, seeing his managing partner's reaction, stood without knowing why, a lifetime of hierarchical conditioning making him mirror his superior's actions. Then Reeves, desperate never to be excluded, scrambled to his feet so quickly he knocked his knee against the table, rattling the crystal. The other partners followed in a wave, each standing because the man next to him had stood, none understanding yet what had prompted this sudden display of respect. Only Clark remained seated, his face wearing the confused half-smile of someone who'd missed the punchline of a joke. He looked from Morrison to Blackstone to the standing executives, his mouth opening to ask what was happening, when Morrison reached down and physically grabbed his arm, hauling him to his feet with surprising strength for a man who spent his days behind a desk. "What's going on?" Clark's voice carried that irritated edge he used when things weren't proceeding according to his script. Marcus's voice filled the Churchill room with the kind of clarity that comes from decades of commanding attention in spaces designed for power. "Gentlemen, Mrs. Audrey Hartwell, owner and chairman of V. Monroe Holdings, proprietor of Meridian." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Even the servers, trained to be invisible, froze mid-motion. The only sound was Charlotte Blackstone's sharp intake of breath, a gasp that seemed to go on forever. I pushed open the doors and entered my domain. Each click of my heels against the Italian marble counted down the seconds of Clark's old life. I didn't hurry. This moment, this walk, this revelation had been building for 4 years, and I would savor every second of it. The Saint Laurent dress moved with me like liquid shadow, the diamonds at my ears catching the light from the baccarat chandelier above, throwing tiny rainbows across the walls. Clark's face began its transformation in real time, a masterclass in psychological collapse that I watched with the detached fascination of a scientist observing an experiment. First came confusion, his eyebrows drawing together as he tried to process why everyone was standing for his plain wife, the one he'd told to stay in her lane just days ago. Then recognition, his eyes widening as they took in the dress, the shoes, the jewelry, all of it worth more than he'd claimed we had in our savings. Finally, the horror, that dawning, crushing realization as his brain finally connected Marcus's words with the woman walking toward him. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound emerged. He looked like a fish pulled from water, gasping for something that was no longer available to him. His hand reached for his champagne glass, missed, knocked it over. The golden liquid spread across the white tablecloth like a prophecy. Charlotte Blackstone's reaction was almost as satisfying. Her perfectly manicured hand flew to her throat in a gesture that would have seemed theatrical if it weren't so genuine. The color drained from her face, leaving her expensive makeup looking like a mask against pale skin. She took a half step backward, then another, trying to put distance between herself and the catastrophe she'd helped create. Marcus pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the one Clark had been occupying with such authority moments before. I sat down with the deliberate grace my grandmother had drilled into me during those long afternoons in her study, when she'd made me practice sitting and standing until my muscles ached. The chair received me like a throne accepting its rightful occupant. Clark stood frozen until Morrison, operating on some primitive understanding of hierarchy, pushed him toward a side chair, the one usually reserved for junior associates or plus ones who didn't merit proper placement. My husband, the senior partner who'd spent the evening boasting about his connections and influence, sat down heavily in his designated spot at the periphery of power. Morrison's mouth moved, trying to form words, apologies, explanations, anything to fill the terrible silence. "Mrs. Hartwell, we had no idea. Clark never mentioned we would have." I raised my hand, a simple gesture that stopped him mid-stammered sentence. The power in that moment, the ability to silence a room full of men who considered themselves masters of the universe, was intoxicating. I turned instead to the Korean executives, who were watching with barely concealed fascination. Ms. Lee had dropped her pretense of not speaking English, her eyes sharp with interest. Mr. Kim and Mr. Park exchanged glances that suggested this was far more entertaining than whatever proposal they'd come to hear. "Mr. Kim, Mr. Park, Ms. Lee, I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd hidden beneath years of artificial submission. I apologize for the confusion. Shall we discuss the real business proposition? I believe my husband's presentation, while enthusiastic, lacks certain essential details about our property holdings in Seoul, our partnership with the Tanaka Group in Tokyo, and the development rights we hold in Singapore. Mr. Kim's eyebrows rose slightly, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from him all evening. You have holdings in Seoul? 3 commercial properties in Gangnam, 2 in Myeongdong. All purchased through V. Monroe Holdings over the past 18 months. I pulled out my phone, swiping to the property portfolio I'd memorized. Our occupancy rate is 97%, with waiting lists for all premium spaces. Clark made a sound, not quite a word, more like air escaping from a punctured tire. I continued without acknowledging him. Marcus appeared at my shoulder with the iPad, the membership database already open. I took it with a nod of thanks, making a show of scrolling through names while the table watched in silent horror. Let's see, I said, my tone conversational, as if reviewing a grocery list rather than determining social fates. Morrison, current standing, 3 violations for inappropriate conduct with staff. Approved for continued membership despite these infractions. Interesting. Morrison's red face turned purple. Those were misunderstandings. I'm sure they were. I continued scrolling. Blackstone, membership approved after a 2-year waiting period. Your wife Charlotte was quite persistent. 17 letters if I recall correctly. Such determination. Charlotte made a small whimpering sound, shrinking into her chair as if she could disappear through sheer will. Reeves, I continued, attempted to donate $50,000 to expedite membership. When informed we don't accept bribes, your father-in-law threatened to review our license agreements. Creative approach to networking. Reeves's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his usual nervous laughter completely absent. I set down the iPad and looked directly at Clark for the first time since entering. His face had gone gray, the kind of color that suggested either imminent cardiac event or complete psychological collapse. Clark Hartwell, I said, letting his name hang in the air like an accusation. Current membership status. Under review. Under review? His voice cracked on the words. Marcus stepped forward slightly. We have standards at Meridian, Mr. Hartwell. Members who embarrass their spouses, who describe them as too plain for polite company, who suggest they should stay in their lane. Well, such behavior indicates a character deficit incompatible with our values. Clark's chair scraped against the marble floor with a sound like fingernails on glass as he shot to his feet, his face flushed with a combination of alcohol and desperation. His hands gripped the edge of the table hard enough to make his knuckles white, and when he spoke, his voice carried the forced authority of someone trying to regain control of an uncontrollable situation. Audrey, we need to discuss this privately. Now. I continued scrolling through the membership database on the iPad, not bothering to look up at him. The dismissal was deliberate, calculated to demonstrate the shift in power dynamics to everyone watching. You wanted me to stay in my lane, darling, I said, my voice carrying the same casual cruelty he'd used when delivering those words. This is my lane. It just happens to include every building you've spent 3 years trying to impress people in. Clark turned to Morrison, then Blackstone, his hands gesturing frantically as he tried to salvage something from the wreckage. This is clearly a misunderstanding. I had no idea Audrey had any connection to Meridian. She never mentioned. So you're incompetent? Morrison's voice cut through Clark's stammering. You lived with the owner of the most exclusive club in the city for 4 years and never knew? Clark's face reddened further. She deceived me. She lied about who she was. Or, I said, finally looking up from the iPad, you never asked. You assumed I was exactly what you wanted me to be. Someone inferior who made you feel superior. Someone too plain for your sophisticated world. Charlotte Blackstone chose that moment to attempt her escape. She rose from her chair with practiced grace, pressing a hand to her forehead in a gesture of distress that might have been convincing if her eyes weren't darting toward the exit like a trapped animal. I'm feeling faint, she announced to no one in particular. The heat, perhaps. I should. Charlotte, I called out, my voice sweet as honey laced with arsenic. Leaving so soon? But you haven't told everyone about your Tuesday lunches with my husband. She froze mid-step, her designer heel hovering above the floor. Those Instagram posts were so enlightening. Power lunch with brilliant minds. Discussing futures with someone special. Some conversations change everything. All tagged at Meridian, all during Clark's supposed client emergencies. I pulled out my phone, the screenshots Janet had taken already loaded. 12 photos over 6 months. Your husband David is still in Tokyo, isn't he? He returns tomorrow, I believe. I'm sure he'd be fascinated to hear about these business discussions. The sound Charlotte made wasn't quite a word, more like air being squeezed from a balloon. Her husband, sitting 3 seats away, had gone rigid, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and rage in the span of seconds. Blackstone's eyes moved between his wife and Clark with the dawning comprehension of a man who'd been too focused on his phone to notice his marriage dissolving in front of him. Charlotte. Blackstone's voice was dangerously quiet. Tuesday lunches? It's not. We were discussing. Clark was helping with. Her explanations tangled and died as she realized there was no innocent explanation for 12 documented meetings her husband knew nothing about. Mr. Kim, who had been watching this drama unfold with the detached interest of someone enjoying dinner theater, cleared his throat delicately. He turned to face me directly, offering a slight bow of acknowledgement. Mrs. Hartwell, he said in perfect English, abandoning any pretense of needing translation. Your property holdings in Seoul, they interest us far more than your husband's proposals. Perhaps we could discuss exclusive use of Meridian for our American operations. I replied in fluent Korean, watching Clark's jaw drop. Of course. Our company is already deeply involved in the Korean market. Mr. Park and Ms. Lee exchanged impressed glances. Ms. Lee pulled out her tablet, fingers flying across the screen as she pulled up what looked like financial projections. You speak Korean, Clark said, the words coming out strangled. 3 years of lessons while you thought I was at the community college, I replied, switching back to English. Tuesday and Thursday mornings. You never asked what classes I was taking. I turned my attention fully to the Korean executives, conducting the rest of the negotiation in their language while Clark sat in stunned silence, unable to follow a conversation that was determining his professional future. Within 3 minutes, we'd outlined the framework for a $40 million exclusive partnership that would give their company permanent space at Meridian and first rights to 3 of my commercial properties in Seoul. Morrison tried to interject something about the existing proposal from Hartwell and Associates, but Mr. Kim dismissed him with a polite but firm gesture. We prefer to work with partners who value transparency, Mr. Kim said, looking pointedly at Clark, and who understand that respect in personal relationships reflects on professional capabilities. The deal that Clark had spent 6 months pursuing, the one that would have secured his promotion to managing partner, evaporated in less time than it took to serve dessert. I stood, smoothing my dress with deliberate calm, and looked down at my husband one last time. Marcus, I said, and the general manager stepped forward immediately. Please process Mr. Hartwell's membership termination tonight. Effective immediately. No. Clark's protest came out as almost a shout. You can't do this. I pay $40,000 a year for that membership. Paid, I corrected. Past tense. Your final statement will be prorated through today. This is vindictive. This is business, I interrupted. The same kind of business you've been conducting while telling me I was too plain to understand it. Marcus pulled out his phone, typing quickly. Security will meet you at the locker room if you have any personal items to collect, Mr. Hartwell. Your access has been revoked as of, he checked his screen, 9:47 p.m. The partners who had spent the evening celebrating Clark's success were now physically backing away from him, their bodies angling toward the door as if his failure might be contagious. Morrison had actually taken 3 steps backward. Blackstone was still staring at his wife with undisguised fury. Reeves had somehow managed to edge himself almost entirely out of the room. Philippe, the photographer who had been documenting Meridian events for a decade, moved through the chaos with practiced invisibility, his camera capturing every moment. Clark's devastation as he realized his world had collapsed. Morrison's desperate attempt to distance himself from his protégé. Charlotte's tears as her husband gathered his coat and left without a word. The Korean executives shaking my hand with genuine respect. And through it all, I stood at the head of the table in my grandmother's diamonds, no longer plain, no longer hidden, no longer willing to stay in any lane but my own. Gentlemen, I said to the room at large, though most were already fleeing. "I believe dinner has concluded." The Churchill room emptied within minutes, executives fleeing like rats from a sinking ship, leaving behind half-eaten meals and abandoned dignity. I remained at the head of the table, watching the exodus with the detached calm of someone who had already won the war. Marcus stood beside me, hands clasped behind his back, witnessing the aftermath of what would become Meridian legend. 3 days later, I sat in the office of Howard Nathanson, the attorney my grandmother had trusted with her empire, watching Clark sign divorce papers with a hand that trembled slightly. He looked smaller somehow, sitting across from me in a suit that hung looser than it had a week ago, his face carrying the hollow look of someone whose entire identity had been stripped away. The prenuptial agreement he'd insisted on before our wedding lay between us, the document he'd presented with such pride, explaining how it would protect his future earnings from a spouse who might try to take advantage. He'd never asked if I had assets to protect. The irony wasn't lost on either of us now as he signed away any claim to my $80 million inheritance. "The apartment contents are specified here," Howard said, sliding another page forward. "Mr. Hartwell retains his clothing, personal electronics, and the furniture he brought into the marriage." Clark's jaw tightened at the word retains, as if keeping his own belongings was some kind of concession I was granting. He signed without reading, past the point of fighting for anything. "I have an offer," he said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "A small firm in Boston. They don't care about what happened." "Good," I said, meaning it. Despite everything, I didn't want him destroyed completely, just removed from my life and properly humbled. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Did you ever love me?" "I loved who I thought you were. You loved who you thought I should be. Neither of us loved who we actually were." He left without another word. The last time I saw Clark Hartwell, he was loading boxes into a U-Haul while our neighbors pretended not to watch, the story of his public humiliation having spread through every social circle that mattered. Mrs. Patterson from 4B actually brought out lemonade for the other residents who had gathered to witness his departure, turning his moving day into an impromptu block party. That afternoon, Janet insisted on taking me to lunch at Meridian to celebrate. Walking through those doors as myself, not pretending to be anything other than the owner, felt like breathing freely for the first time in years. The staff didn't quite know how to act. Some bowed, others applauded. Thomas the valet actually wiped tears from his eyes when he saw me. We sat in the main dining room, not the Churchill room with its recent memories, and Marcus personally selected a bottle of champagne from the cellar. Dom Perignon 1996, he announced with ceremony, presenting it like a sacrament. "That's a $3,000 bottle," I protested. "It was your grandmother's favorite," he replied. "She could never afford it during her secretary years, but she bought a case the day she closed on Meridian. She said someday her granddaughter would drink it in celebration." Janet raised her glass once Marcus had poured, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I have a confession," she said. "I've known about your inheritance all along." The champagne glass paused halfway to my lips. "What?" "Grandma Vivian told me in the hospital those last weeks when you were at work and I'd sit with her during the day. She made me promise to watch over you but never tell you about the money. Audrey needs to learn this lesson herself," she said. "Being underestimated is only a weapon if you learn how to wield it." I thought about all those moments when Janet had bitten her tongue, watching Clark diminish me, knowing I could buy and sell him 1,000 times over. That must have been torture. The hardest thing I've ever done. But she was right. You had to discover your own power in your own time. We toasted my grandmother's memory with champagne she dreamed of drinking when men called her sweetheart, and asked her to fetch coffee while stealing her ideas. Over the following months, I reshaped my life on my own terms. I kept our small apartment but bought the entire building, not for profit but for purpose. The Vivian Monroe Foundation's first project converted it into affordable housing for women leaving bad marriages, women who needed what I'd had. Time to discover their own worth. I still shopped at Target when the mood struck, still clipped coupons from the Sunday paper because my grandmother taught me that wealth without wisdom breeds poverty. The habits of frugality she'd instilled weren't about need anymore but about remembering where power truly comes from, not from money but from understanding value. When I walked into Meridian now, everyone stood. Not from fear or obligation but from genuine respect. I'd earned my place through revelation rather than inheritance. At business forums where I spoke about property development and women's economic independence, young women took notes while their bosses tried to pretend they hadn't dismissed me as Clark's plain wife at dozens of events. Morrison approached me at one such forum, his face carrying the permanent flush of embarrassment it had worn since that night in the Churchill room. "Mrs. Hartwell, I want to apologize again for—" "Stop," I said. "You've apologized 17 times by my count. Either mean it and change or stop saying it." He nodded and scurried away, but I noticed later that he'd promoted 2 female associates that week. Charlotte Blackstone disappeared from the social scene entirely after her husband filed for divorce. The last anyone heard, she was working at a boutique in Connecticut, selling handbags to women who didn't know her history. Her replacement at various charity committees took careful notes whenever I spoke, having learned the value of paying attention to quiet women. On the first anniversary of my revelation at Meridian, I finally opened the envelope my grandmother's lawyer had given me with strict instructions to wait until I understood. The paper inside was thin, her handwriting shaky but determined. "My dearest Audrey," it began, "being plain is not about faces or fashion. It's about letting others reveal themselves while you build your empire in silence. They never see us coming because they never truly see us at all. Men like your Clark. And yes, I knew what he was the moment you introduced him. They mistake visibility for value. Use their blindness. Build your power. Then stand in your truth and watch them kneel." At the bottom, in writing so shaky I could barely read it, "Piss, that Clark is an ass. Destroy him beautifully." I had the letter professionally framed and hung it above my desk in the V. Monroe Holdings office, where every visiting executive could read it. More than one had stood before it, color draining from their face as they wondered who in their life they might have underestimated. The frame shop owner, a woman in her 60s named Dorothy, had read it while mounting it and said quietly, "Your grandmother sounds like someone who understood the long game." She understood that being underestimated was just another form of armor, I replied. Dorothy smiled. "The best kind. The one they never see until it's too late." Now, a year later, I stand in that same office, looking out at the city my grandmother conquered in silence and I now rule openly. Being plain was never about beauty. It was about being invisible enough to see everything while revealing nothing until the perfect moment. Clark had been right about one thing: I was too plain for his world. But his world was small, built on appearances and approval. My world, my grandmother's world, was built on patience, power, and the perfect moment to reveal that the plainest faces often hide the sharpest minds. If this story of calculated revenge left you absolutely speechless, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Audrey walked into the Churchill room and everyone stood for the plain wife Clark had dismissed. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more incredible stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.